A little over a year ago, Elegoo released the Elegoo Mars 3. Now, a year later, they came out with the Mars 3 Pro. This is an updated version of the Mars 3 with a couple of significant updates that make printing a lot better and also a lot more pleasant. I'm not going to go in depth, but if you want to know more, feel free to check out Elegoo's website. A couple months ago, they sent me the 3 Pro to test out for you guys and to show you what this machine can do, and I have since used it on various projects that you could have seen on my channel already. Now, last year when they sent out the Mars 3, I did a pretty similar project on the Ariel Atom created by my friend Olivizzle. He created a super cool model that is available for purchase, and you can print it in 1/24th scale and make your own model kit. So I did that last year on the regular Ariel Atom, and there is a video on my channel about that. If you haven't checked it out yet, feel free to click the links in the top right corner and it will take you to that video. Since that last video, Elegoo was not the only one that updated their product. Oliver has done the same, and he came out with the V8 version of the Ariel Atom. It has some upgrades on the exterior, interior, and on a lot of the main parts itself. With both of the products now being updated, I figured it would be really cool to do another build on the updated machine with the updated files and see what it is capable of and what build I can put out. In this video, I will not be going over all of the printing, cleaning, and prepping process. There are multiple videos on my channel going in depth on all of those subjects, and the main details are still the same, so those are still relevant if you want to check those out. In the meantime, of course, a couple of days, a couple of hours, and a couple of prints later, all of the parts have been printed and are ready to go. So as you can see, even with the smallest of parts, every single detail has been perfectly captured, even down to some of the super small springs, the valve stems, and even the bolts and nuts on the wheels themselves. On some of these parts, since they are updated and could be a bit fragile, there are a couple of braces on the front splitter and the rear spoiler. I think the front could also be put down as a spoiler, but who knows. Those of course need to be removed, but it is supposed to be removed after curing, otherwise the parts could warp, and these keep them in place nice and steady. With that said and done, it is time to move on to prepping the parts even further by sanding them down with some 400 grit before I move on to primer. Even though I said I would be moving on to primer, there is still one more step to do on a couple of parts. Since these are 3D printed, there are supports on the underside of the parts, and those leave some divots, pin marks, pinholes, whatever you want to call it. And on most of these spots I will be removing them, but since they are pretty much hidden with the model in its normal resting place, I will not be spending hours upon hours on parts that will never be seen. Most of them will simply just be sanded down a little bit, and then they are good to go. Others do require a little bit of filling, and I'm simply just going to be using some of the resin that I printed the model with, putting that into all of those small pinholes where necessary, curing it with a UV light, acting it as a sort of filler or bondo if you want to call it, and then just sanding it back down in order for it all to be ready to be painted. But first, again, something else, I did mess up a little bit when removing the supports on the front section of the frame, and also accidentally removed a couple of those pieces that weren't supposed to be removed, so those needed to be replaced, and with a simple brass rod that was really easily done. Now then, on to primer. I'm going to be priming these with Splash Paints as primer. I have mixed some black and some light gray together, as both of these bottles were almost empty and I could just mix them together to create a little bit more and also a bit darker of a tone of a gray for these parts to be primed in, which is perfect for my use. And after the primer had been applied to all of those parts, I could move on to the flat black that will later on be clear coated and then turned into gloss black, but that is just the base coat for a lot of these parts, and for some even the final color. Some other parts needed to be painted in silver, like the engine and exhaust. That was just done in a couple of coats, and later on all of the additional details will be painted on by hand and a small brush. Now, since this one is a bit more extravagant than the original one, and I kind of liked the way the original specification of this V8 version came from Ariel themselves, with the red highlights, the gold, and the black, combining it all together. But I did want to give it a bit of a twist and a bit of a personal touch by adding some red in areas that isn't done by the factory, and just customizing it my way, but still just following the livery that Ariel created themselves roughly, because I really liked the way that looked. But I'm also going to be doing some of the end plates on the wings in the red just to make it stand out even more, and also a lot of other complicated areas were simply just copied from the original Ariel Atom design and transferred it to my model. So about 10 coats of red later, since it didn't really want to cover on top of the black as I kind of expected, but I didn't really want to do anything else about it, and I figured there would be enough paint on here already, so putting another base layer underneath it would only make it thicker. Never mind, just moving on. After those coats were applied, I removed all of the masking tape. There was a little bit of bleed through on a couple of areas. A super small amount of thinners was put onto a cotton swab, and then carefully removed the excess red paint that wasn't supposed to be there, and then I could remove more masking tape on the other parts. The black and red has now mostly been completed, so I could move on to the next color, and that is going to be the gold. The main frame will be painted in this gold. Some of the interior framing will be done in that same gold as well, along with the wheels, before then moving on to giving it all a nice glossy clear coat. Not all of the black pieces need to be done in a gloss clear coat, so the main seats and the main interior tub were all masked off, for just those side air inlets to be gloss clear coated, along with the rear inlet and engine cover and some other pieces all around. I gave the clear coat a couple of days to fully cure before then again masking it off another time for some of the flat black to be repainted on a couple of other areas. Now I could have also just masked it off and then applied the gloss clear, but since I do tend to apply the clear coat a bit heavy, that's not really the best way to do it, as it would make a really thick edge along the masking and leave a really ugly look in the end. Instead, I'm just masking the glossy parts off and then going over the other parts with a bit of flat black just to tone it down and give it the plastic look that it requires to be. A couple coats of flat black later and I could once again start unmasking it, probably for the final time, but who knows. Not all of the frame needs to be painted in the gold, so I did need to start adding a bit of black back to it again. Now I could have just painted this and started really complicated masking that would have taken hours upon hours, but instead I just simply decided to do it with a brush and some black paint. That was a lot easier, a lot quicker, and looks pretty much the same, even though the finish is not exactly as smooth as it could be. But I wasn't going to start masking off all of these tubes for hours upon hours and then again unmasking it for another couple of hours for such a small detail, which looks perfectly fine in the end after a couple coats of brush painted flat black. In the meantime, I've started adding some silver, some black, some gunmetal, and some other colors to various bits around with a brush again, just to detail it and finish those pieces off as well. And with that final caliper now painted black too, I could move on to the assembly. Now there are no instructions on this, even though there aren't all that many parts. It could still be a little bit tough to figure out which parts needs to go where, and also in which order they need to be put in. Now, even though that I built this model, or roughly this model, a year ago, I didn't remember a single thing of what I did back then because some other things came in between, I simply didn't remember. So I did have to go by feel and just looking at some pictures online of the actual car to see what part needs to go where, but roughly it is all pretty much self-explanatory what needs to go where and which order. Now it doesn't have to specifically be this order, it could be any other order of course, but some of the big parts need to be put in first, and then all of the smaller parts will still be accessible since it is pretty much an exoskeleton of a vehicle. Some chrome tie downs were added to the fire extinguisher. That was then glued in place. The gear shifter could then be put in as well, and then the main parts around it could also be fit on. For the gauge cluster, I did add a couple of colors just with some permanent marker, some black, some red, and some blue, or no black, that was already there, and some orange. I didn't have any more gauge decals that were fitting for this one, so I simply just had to leave it here with the smallest amount of detail possible, still making it look pretty good, and the steering wheel will pretty much hide all of it, so in the end it's not too bad. Moving on to the wheels and tires. These tires were printed as well on the Elegoo Mars3 Pro with flexible black resin. If you want to know the settings, they are right here on the screen. And after printing them, they were just ever so slightly too big, creating a little bit of a loose fit. Now that can easily be fixed by scaling down the print about 1% and then printing it again, or just adding a bit of thickness to the wheel with some masking tape. I just put 2 rounds of masking tape or 2 layers of masking tape on the wheel, and that created a super snug and tight fit on the tire and wheel, having the perfect solution as it doesn't really waste any more material, and this is just as good in my opinion. So like I said, the tires were also 3D printed, but then in the black flexible resin. And since they are printed, they also have the support marks on the side you put them on, and those are quite ugly, and since this is a pretty much open wheel car, you can see all sides of the tire, and that needs to be cleaned up. So I decided to create a small jig or tool for on my drill in order to put the tires on it, and then use the power of the drill and some sandpapers to sand it all down. The drill in this case will pretty much turn into a sort of lathe, to create it, to put it really simply, and I'm just making a small piece that fits onto the drill with a small screw through it, and the tire fits tightly on there as well, so I can just spin it around, hold the sandpaper against it, and start sanding down and polishing the edge of the tire, cleaning it up nicely, and also doing the same to the thread or tread area of the tire just to make it a lot nicer. After that super complicated designing on Tinkercad, I simply exported the file, sliced it in the slicer, put it into the Creality Sonic pad attached to my Creality Ender 3, and then printed out this small jig. It took about 10 to 11 minutes for it to fully print, and then I was ready to go and start sanding the tires. The jig mounted into the drill, the tire put on, I could start with the first rough stage, and that is getting rid of all of those pimples and divots with about a 180 grit, and then start polishing it up. So first off, the tire sidewall I want to leave as clean as possible. The tread I also want to sand, but this horrible marking on the back needs to be finished off and completely left as a smooth part. So first off, I'm just going to start with a 400 grit. That looked pretty good, but still a little bit rough. Then moved over to a 600 grit, a 1000 grit, 1500, and even a 3000. And then in the end, I decided which version I liked best, and used that on all tires, of course. So I'm not going to show all of them as they look pretty similar on camera, but overall the 3000 grit was a bit too glossy, a bit too shiny, and I went with the 1500 as the final finish and used that on all tires, put them onto the wheels and glued them in place. Now with this version of the Ariel Atom, Oliver has created a new set of wheels. I didn't really know which one I liked best, so I went with my solution that I usually go for if I can't choose, and that is putting one set on one side and the other set on the other, as you can only see one side at a time, and you do now have benefit of having both of the wheel sets on there. So if you like the other one better, just simply turn the model around, and if you then change your mind again like I do, turn it around again and you have a fresh set of wheels. In this kit there are some clear parts that need to be printed too. For the headlights and the taillights, they are basically the same part that needs to be printed out multiple times and could then be glued in place. These were printed with the Area Clear resin, glued in place with some Bob Smith Industries Super Gold Plus, and then afterwards, once the glue was dried, I clear coated them with a small brush and some gloss clear coat to make them nice and shiny and also super translucent. The final detail that needed to be put on were some of these reservoirs for the shock absorbers, or the coilovers in this case. That is also an upgrade on this kit, and with that said and done, it is completed. I hope you guys liked this build as much as I did. It is a super cool process to start with a 3D file, print it, clean it up, and actually end up with a fully finished model kit. And I will be doing many more of these projects in the future, so if you enjoy these, feel free to leave a comment down below and let me know what you want to see next. And also send me some links to some creators for files you like, and maybe one of those will be printed up as well.